The Adventures of Crusoe the Dog. Chapter 1. Crusoe was once a pup. Courteous listener, don't toss your head contemptuously and exclaim, "Of course he was, I could have told you that." You know very well that you have often seen a man above 6 feet high, broad and powerful as a lion, with a bronzed shaggy visage and the stern glance of an eagle, of whom you have said, or thought, or heard others say, "It is scarcely possible to believe that such a man was once a squalling baby." If you had seen our hero in all the strength and majesty of full-grown doglyhood, you would have experienced a vague sort of surprise had we told you, as we now repeat, that the dog Crusoe was once a pup, a soft, round, sprawling, squeaking pup, as fat as a tallow candle, and as blind as a bat. But we draw particular attention to the fact of Crusoe's having once been a pup, because in connection with the days of his puppyhood there hangs a tale. This peculiar dog may thus be said to have had 2 tales, one in connection with his body, the other with his career. This tale, though short, is very harrowing, and as it is intimately connected with Crusoe's subsequent history, we will relate it here. But before doing so we must beg our reader to accompany us beyond the civilized portions of the United States of America, beyond the frontier settlements of the far west, into those wild prairies which are watered by the great Missouri River, the father of waters, and his numerous tributaries. Here dwell the Pawnees, the Sioux, the Delawares, the Crows, the Blackfeet, and many other tribes of red Indians, who are gradually retreating step by step towards the Rocky Mountains as the advancing white man cuts down their trees and plows up their prairies. Here, too, dwell the wild horse and the wild ass, the deer, the buffalo, and the badger, all, men and brutes alike, wild as the power of untamed and ungovernable passion can make them, and free as the wind that sweeps over their mighty plains. There is a romantic and exquisitely beautiful spot on the banks of one of the tributaries above referred to, a long stretch of mingled woodland and meadow, with a magnificent lake lying like a gem in its green bosom, which goes by the name of the Mustang Valley. This remote vale, even at the present day, is but thinly peopled by white men, and is still a frontier settlement round which the wolf and the bear prowl curiously, and from which the startled deer bounds terrified away. At the period of which we write, the valley had just been taken possession of by several families of squatters, who, tired of the turmoil and the squabbles of the then frontier settlements, had pushed boldly into the far west to seek a new home for themselves, where they could have elbow room, regardless alike of the dangers they might encounter in unknown lands and of the redskins who dwelt there. The squatters were well armed with axes, rifles, and ammunition. Most of the women were used to dangers and alarms, and placed implicit reliance in the power of their fathers, husbands, and brothers to protect them, and well they might, for a bolder set of stalwart men than these backwoods men never trod the wilderness. Each had been trained to the use of the rifle and the axe from infancy, and many of them had spent so much of their lives in the woods, that they were more than a match for the Indian in his own peculiar pursuits of hunting and war. When the squatters first issued from the woods bordering the valley, an immense herd of wild horses or mustangs were browsing on the plain. These no sooner beheld the cavalcade of white men than, uttering a wild neigh, they tossed their flowing manes in the breeze and dashed away like a whirlwind. This incident procured the valley its name. The newcomers gave one satisfied glance at their future home, and then set to work to erect log huts forthwith. Soon the axe was heard ringing through the forests, and tree after tree fell to the ground, while the occasional sharp ring of a rifle told that the hunters were catering successfully for the camp. In course of time the Mustang Valley began to assume the aspect of a thriving settlement, with cottages and waving fields clustered together in the midst of it. Of course the savages soon found it out, and paid it occasional visits. These dark-skinned tenants of the woods brought furs of wild animals with them, which they exchanged with the white men for knives, and beads, and baubles and trinkets of brass and tin. But they hated palefaces with bitter hatred, because their encroachments had at this time materially curtailed the extent of their hunting grounds, and nothing but the numbers and known courage of the squatters prevented these savages from butchering and scalping them all. The leader of this band of pioneers was a Major Hope, a gentleman whose love for nature in its wildest aspects determined him to exchange barrack life for a life in the woods. The Major was a first-rate shot, a bold, fearless man, and an enthusiastic naturalist. He was past the prime of life, and, being a bachelor, was unencumbered with a family. His first act on reaching the site of the new settlement was to commence the erection of a blockhouse, to which the people might retire in case of a general attack by the Indians. In this blockhouse Major Hope took up his abode as the guardian of the settlement, and here the dog Crusoe was born. Here he sprawled in the early morn of life, here he leaped, and yelped, and wagged his shaggy tail in the excessive glee of puppyhood, and from the wooden portals of this blockhouse he bounded forth to the chase in all the fire, and strength, and majesty of full-grown doghood. Crusoe's father and mother were magnificent Newfoundlanders. There was no doubt as to their being of the genuine breed, for Major Hope had received them as a parting gift from a brother officer, who had brought them both from Newfoundland itself. The father's name was Crusoe, the mother's name was Fan. Why the father had been so called no one could tell. The man from whom Major Hope's friend had obtained the pair was a poor, illiterate fisherman, who had never heard of the celebrated Robinson in all his life. All he knew was that Fan had been named after his own wife. As for Crusoe, he had got him from a friend, who had got him from another friend, whose cousin had received him as a marriage gift from a friend of his, and that each had said to the other that the dog's name was Crusoe, without reasons being asked or given on either side. On arriving at New York, the Major's friend, as we have said, made him a present of the dogs. Not being much of a dog fancier, he soon tired of old Crusoe, and gave him away to a gentleman, who took him down to Florida, and that was the end of him. Lie was never heard of more. When Crusoe, Jr., was born, he was born, of course, without a name. That was given to him afterwards, in honor of his father. He was also born in company with a brother and 2 sisters, all of whom drowned themselves accidentally, in the first month of their existence, by falling into the river which flowed past the blockhouse, a calamity which occurred, doubtless, in consequence of their having gone out without their mother's leave. Little Crusoe was with his brother and sisters at the time, and fell in along with them, but was saved from sharing their fate by his mother, who, seeing what had happened, dashed with an agonized howl into the water, and, seizing him in her mouth, brought him ashore in a half-drowned condition. She afterwards brought the others ashore one by one, but the poor little things were dead. And now we come to the harrowing part of our tale, for the proper understanding of which the foregoing dissertation was needful. One beautiful afternoon, in that charming season of the American year called the Indian summer, there came a family of Sioux Indians to the Mustang Valley, and pitched their tent close to the blockhouse. A young hunter stood leaning against the gatepost of the palisades, watching the movements of the Indians, who, having just finished a long palaver or talk with Major Hope, were now in the act of preparing supper. A fire had been kindled on the green sward in front of the tent, and above it stood a tripod, from which depended a large tin camp kettle. Over this hung an ill-favored Indian woman, or squaw, who, besides attending to the contents of the pot, bestowed sundry cuffs and kicks upon her little child, which sat near to her playing with several Indian curs that gamboled round the fire. The master of the family and his 2 sons reclined on buffalo robes, smoking their stone pipes or calumets in silence. There was nothing peculiar in their appearance. Their faces were neither dignified nor coarse in expression, but wore an aspect of stupid apathy, which formed a striking contrast to the countenance of the young hunter, who seemed an amused spectator of their proceedings. The youth referred to was very unlike, in many respects, to what we are accustomed to suppose a backwoods hunter should be. He did not possess that quiet gravity and staid demeanor which often characterize these men. True, he was tall and strongly made, but no one would have called him stalwart, and his frame indicated grace and agility rather than strength. But the point about him which rendered him different from his companions was his bounding, irrepressible flow of spirits, strangely coupled with an intense love of solitary wandering in the woods. None seemed so well fitted for social enjoyment as he, none laughed so heartily, or expressed such glee in his mischief-loving eye, yet for days together he went off alone into the forest, and wandered where his fancy led him, as grave and silent as an Indian warrior. After all, there was nothing mysterious in this. The boy followed implicitly the dictates of nature within him. He was amiable, straightforward, sanguine, and intensely earnest. When he laughed he let it out, as sailors have it, with a will. When there was good cause to be grave, no power on earth could make him smile. We have called him boy, but in truth he was about that uncertain period of life when a youth is said to be neither a man nor a boy. His face was good-looking, every earnest, candid face is, and masculine. His hair was reddish-brown, and his eye bright blue. He was costumed in the deerskin cap, leggings, moccasins, and leathern shirt common to the western hunter. "You seem tickled with the Injuns," Dick Varley said to a man who at that moment issued from the blockhouse. "That's just what I am, Joe Blunt," replied the youth, turning with a broad grin to his companion. "Have a care, lad, do not laugh at 'em too much. They soon take offense, and them redskins never forgive." "But I'm only laughing at the baby," returned the youth, pointing to the child, which, with a mixture of boldness and timidity, was playing with a pup, wrinkling up its hid visage into a smile when its playmate rushed away in sport, and opening wide its jet-black eyes in grave anxiety as the pup returned at full gallop. "It should make an owl laugh," continued young Varley, "to see such a queer picture of itself." He paused suddenly, and a dark frown covered his face as he saw the Indian woman stoop quickly down, catch the pup by its hind leg with one hand, seize a heavy piece of wood with the other, and strike it several violent blows on the throat. Without taking the trouble to kill the poor animal outright, the savage then held its still writhing body over the fire in order to singe off the hair before putting it into the pot to be cooked. The cruel act drew young Yarley's attention more closely to the pup, and it flashed across his mind that Tills could be no other than young Crusoe, which neither he nor his companion had before seen, although they had often heard others speak of and describe it. Had the little creature been one of the unfortunate Indian curs, the two hunters would probably have turned from the sickening sight with disgust, feeling that, however much they might dislike such cruelty, it would be of no use attempting to interfere with Indian usages. But the instant the idea that it was Crusoe occurred to Yarley, he uttered a yell of anger, and sprang towards the woman with a bound that caused the three Indians to leap to their feet and grasp their tomahawks. Blunt did not move from the gate, but threw forward his rifle with a careless motion, but an expressive glance, that caused the Indians to resume their seats and pipes with an emphatic wail of disgust at having been startled out of their propriety by a trifle, while Dick Yarley snatched poor Crusoe from his dangerous and painful position, scowled angrily in the woman's face, and, turning on his heel, walked up to the house holding the pup tenderly in his arms. Joe Blunt gazed after his friend with a grave, solemn expression of countenance till he disappeared, then he looked at the ground and shook his head. Joe was one of the regular out-and-out backwoods hunters, both in appearance and in fact, broad, tall, massive, lion-like, gifted with the hunting, stalking, running, and trail-following powers of the savage, and with a superabundance of the shooting and fighting powers, the daring and dash of the Anglo-Saxon. He was grave, too, seldom smiled, and rarely laughed. His expression almost at all times was a compound of seriousness and good humor. With the rifle he was a good, steady shot, but by no means a crack one. His ball never failed to hit, but it often failed to kill. After meditating a few seconds, Joe Blunt again shook his head, and muttered to himself, "The boy's bold enough, but he's too reckless for a hunter." There was no need for that yell, now, none at all. Having uttered this sagacious remark, he threw his rifle into the hollow of his left arm, turned round, and strode off with a long, slow step towards his own cottage. Blunt was an American by birth, but of Irish extraction, and to an attentive ear there was a faint echo of the brogue in his tone, which seemed to have been handed down to him as a threadbare and almost worn-out heirloom. Poor Crusoe was singed almost naked. His wretched tail seemed little better than a piece of wire filed off to a point, and he vented his misery in piteous squeaks as the sympathetic Yarley confided him tenderly to the care of his mother. How Fan managed to cure him no one can tell, but cure him she did, for, in the course of a few weeks, Crusoe was as well, and sleek, and fat as ever. Chapter 2. A Shooting Match and Its Consequences. New friends introduced to the reader. Crusoe and his mother change masters. Shortly after the incident narrated in the last chapter, the squatters of the Mustang Valley lost their leader. Major Hope suddenly announced his intention of quitting the settlement and returning to the civilized world. Private matters, he said, required his presence there, matters which he did not choose to speak of, but which would prevent his returning again to reside among them. Go he must, and being a man of determination, go he did, but before going he distributed all his goods and chattels among the settlers. He even gave away his rifle, and fan, and Crusoe. These last, however, he resolved should go together, and as they were well worth having, he announced that he would give them to the best shot in the valley. He stipulated that the winner should escort him to the nearest settlement eastward, after which he might return with the rifle on his shoulder. Accordingly, a long level piece of ground on the river's bank, with a perpendicular cliff at the end of it, was selected as the shooting ground, and, on the appointed day, at the appointed hour, the competitors began to assemble. "Well, lad, first as usual," exclaimed Joe Blunt, as he reached the ground and found Dick Varley there before him. "I've been here more than an hour looking for a new kind o' flower that Jack Morgan told me he'd seen. And I've found it too. Look here, did you ever see one like it before?" Blunt leaned his rifle against the tree and carefully examined the flower. "Why, yes, I've seed a many o' them up about the Rocky Mountains, but never one hereaway. It seems to have gone lost itself. The last I seed, if I remember rightly, was near the headwaters o' the Yellowstone River. It was just where I shot a grizzly bar." "Was that the bar that gave you the wipe on the cheek?" asked Yarley, forgetting the flower in his interest about the bear. "It was. I put 6 balls in that bear's carcass, and stuck my knife into its heart 10 times afore it gave out, and it nearly ripped the shirt off my back afore I was done with it. I would give my rifle to get a chance at a grizzly," exclaimed Yarley, with a sudden burst of enthusiasm. "Whoever got it wouldn't have much to brag of," remarked a burly young backwoodsman as he joined them. His remark was true, for poor Dick's weapon was but a sorry affair. It missed fire, and it hung fire, and even when it did fire it remained a matter of doubt in its owner's mind whether the slight deviations from the direct line made by his bullets were the result of his or its bad shooting. Further comment upon it was checked by the arrival of a dozen or more hunters on the scene of action. They were a sturdy set of bronzed, bold, fearless men, and one felt, on looking at them, that they would prove more than a match for several hundreds of Indians in open fight. A few minutes after, the Major himself came on the ground with the prize rifle on his shoulder, and Fan and Crusoe at his heels, the latter tumbling, scrambling, and yelping after its mother, fat and clumsy, and happy as possible, having evidently quite forgotten that it had been nearly roasted alive only a few weeks before. Immediately all eyes were on the rifle, and its merits were discussed with animation. And well did it deserve discussion, for such a piece had never before been seen on the western frontier. It was shorter in the barrel and larger in the bore than the weapons chiefly in vogue at that time, and besides being of beautiful workmanship, was silver-mounted. But the grand peculiarity about it, and that which afterwards rendered it the mystery of mysteries to the savages, was that it had 2 sets of locks, one percussion, the other flint, so that, when caps failed, by taking off the one set of locks and affixing the others, it was converted into a flint rifle. The Major, however, took care never to run short of caps, so that the flint locks were merely held as a reserve in case of need. "Now, lads," cried Major Hope, stepping up to the point whence they were to shoot, "remember the terms. He who first drives the nail obtains the rifle, Fan, and her pup, and accompanies me to the nearest settlements. Each man shoots with his own gun, and draws lots for the chance." "Agreed," cried the men. "Well, then, wipe your guns and draw lots. Henri will fix the nail. Here it is." The individual who stepped, or rather plunged forward to receive the nail was a rare and remarkable specimen of mankind. Like his comrades, he was half a farmer and half a hunter. Like them, too, he was clad in deerskin, and was tall and strong, nay, more, he was gigantic. But, unlike them, he was clumsy, awkward, loose-jointed, and a bad shot. Nevertheless, Henri was an immense favorite in the settlement, for his good humor knew no bounds. No one ever saw him frown. Even when fighting with the savages, he was sometimes compelled to do in self-defense, he went at them with a sort of jovial rage that was almost laughable. Inconsiderate recklessness was one of his chief characteristics, so that his comrades were rather afraid of him on the war trail or in the hunt, where caution, and frequently soundless motion, were essential to success or safety. But when Henri had a comrade at his side to check him, he was safe enough, being humble-minded and obedient. Men used to say he must have been born under a lucky star, for notwithstanding his natural inaptitude for all sorts of backwoods life, he managed to scramble through everything with safety, often with success, and sometimes with credit. To see Henri stalk a deer was worth a long day's journey. Joe Blunt used to say he was all gent. Together, from the top of his head to the sole of his moccasin. He threw his immense form into the most inconceivable contortions, and slowly wound his way, sometimes on hands and knees, sometimes flat, through bush and brake, as if there was not a bone in his body, and without the slightest noise. This sort of work was so much against his plunging nature that he took long to learn it, but when, through hard practice and the loss of many a fine deer, he came at length to break himself into it, he gradually progressed to perfection, and ultimately became the best stalker in the valley. This, and this alone, enabled him to procure game, for being short-sighted, Lithe could hit nothing beyond 50 yards, except a buffalo or a barn door. Yet that same lithe body, which seemed as though totally unhinged, could no more be bent, when the muscles were strong, than an iron post. No one wrestled with Henri unless he wished to have his back broken. Few could equal and none could beat him at running or leaping except Dick Yarley. When Henri ran a race, even Joe Blunt laughed outright, for arms and legs went like independent flails. When he leaped, he hurled himself into space with a degree of violence that seemed to ensure a somersault, yet he always came down with a crash on his feet. Plunging was Henri's forte. He generally lounged about the settlement, when unoccupied, with his hands behind his back, apparently in a reverie, and when called on to act, he seemed to fancy he must have lost time, and could only make up for it by plunging. This habit got him into many awkward scrapes, but his Herculean power as often got him out of them. He was a French-Canadian, and a particularly bad speaker of the English language. We offer no apology for this elaborate introduction of Henri, for he was as good-hearted a fellow as ever lived, and deserved special notice. But to return. The sort of rifle practice called driving the nail, by which this match was to be decided, was, and we believe still is, common among the hunters of the far west. It consisted in this: an ordinary large-headed nail was driven a short way into a plank or a tree, and the hunters, standing at a distance of 50 yards or so, fired at it until they succeeded in driving it home. On the present occasion the major resolved to test their shooting by making the distance 70 yards. Some of the older men shook their heads. "It's too far," said one. "Ye might as well try to snuff the nose o' a mosquito." "Jim Scraggs is the only man as it'll hit that," said another. The man referred to was a long, lank, lantern-jawed fellow with a cross-grained expression of countenance. He used the long, heavy Kentucky rifle, which, from the ball being little larger than a pea, was called a pea rifle. Jim was no favorite and had been named Scraggs by his companions on account of his appearance. In a few minutes the lots were drawn, and the shooting began. Each hunter wiped out the barrel of his piece with his ramrod as he stepped forward, then, placing a ball in the palm of his left hand, he drew the stopper of his powder horn with his teeth, and poured out as much powder as sufficed to cover the bullet. This was the regular measure among them. Little time was lost in filing, for these men did not hang on their aim. The point of the rifle was slowly raised to the object, and, the instant the sight covered it, the ball sped to its mark. In a few minutes the nail was encircled by bullet holes, scarcely two of which were more than an inch distant from the mark, and one, fired by Joe Blunt, entered the tree close beside it. "All, Joe," said the major, "I thought you would have carried off the prize." "So did not I, sir," returned Blunt, with a shake of his head. "Had it been $50 at 100 yards, I'd ha' done better, but I never could hit the nail. It's too small to see." "That's 'cause ye got no eyes," remarked Jim Scraggs, with a sneer, as he stepped forward. All tongues were now hushed, for the expected champion was about to fire. The sharp crack of the rifle was followed by a shout, for Jim had hit the nail-head on the edge, and part of the bullet stuck to it. "That wins if there's no better," said the major, scarce able to conceal his disappointment. "Who comes next?" To this question Henri answered by stepping up to the line, straddling his legs, and executing preliminary movements with his rifle, That seemed to indicate an intention on his part to throw the weapon bodily at the mark. He was received with a shout of mingled laughter and applause. After gazing steadily at the mark for a few seconds, a broad grin overspread his countenance, and, looking round at his companions, he said, "Ha! My boys, I cannot behold the nail at all." "Can ye behold the tree?" shouted a voice, when the laugh that followed this announcement had somewhat abated. "Oh, we," replied Henri quite coolly, "I can see him, and a got small bit of de forest beyond." "Fire at it, then. If you hit the tree you deserve the rifle, leastwise you ought to get the pup." Henri grinned again, and fired instantly, without taking aim. The shot was followed by an exclamation of surprise, for the bullet was found close beside the nail. "It's more be good luck than good shootin'," remarked Jim Scraggs. "Possible," answered Henri, modestly, as he retreated to the rear and wiped out his rifle. "I have killed most of my deer by dat same god luck." "Bravo, Henri," said Major Hope as he passed. "You deserve to win, anyhow." "Who's next?" "Dick Varley," cried several voices. "Where's Yarley?" "Come on, youngster, and take your shot." The youth came forward with evident reluctance. "It's of no manner o' use," he whispered to Joe Blunt as he passed. "I can't depend on my old guns." "Never give in," whispered Blunt, encouragingly. Poor Varley's want of confidence in his rifle was merited, for, on pulling the trigger, the faithless lock missed fire. "Lend him another gun," cried several voices. "'Gainst rules laid down by Major Hope," said Serrags. "Well, so it is, try again." Varley did try again, and so successfully, too, that the ball hit the nail on the head, leaving a portion of the lead sticking to its edge. Of course this was greeted with a cheer, and a loud dispute began as to which was the better shot of the two. "There are others to shoot yet," cried the major. "Make way. Look out." The men fell back, and the few hunters who had not yet fired took their shots, but without coming nearer the mark. It was now agreed that Jim Serrags and Dick Varley, being the two best shots, should try over again, and it was also agreed that Dick should have the use of Blunt's rifle. Lots were again drawn for the first shot, and it fell to Dick, who immediately stepped out, aimed somewhat hastily, and fired. "Hit again," shouted those who had run forward to examine the mark. Half the bullet cut off by the nail head. Some of the more enthusiastic of Dick's friends cheered lustily, but the most of the hunters were grave and silent, for they knew Jim's powers, and felt that he would certainly do his best. Jim now stepped up to the line, and, looking earnestly at the mark, threw forward his rifle. At that moment our friend Crusoe, tired of tormenting his mother, waddled stupidly and innocently into the midst of the crowd of men, and, in so doing, received Henry's heel and the full weight of his elephantine body on its forepaw. The horrible and electric yell that instantly issued from his agonized throat could only be compared, as Joe Blunt expressed it, to the last dying screech of a bustin' steam biler. We cannot say that the effect was startling, for these backwoodsmen had been born and bred in the midst of alarms, and were so used to them that a bustin' steam biler itself, unless it had blown them fairly off their legs, would not have startled them. But the effect, such as it was sufficient to disconcert the aim of Jim Scraggs, who fired at the same instant, and missed the nail by a hair's breadth. Turning round in towering wrath, Scraggs aimed a kick at the poor pup, which, had it taken effect, would certainly have terminated the innocent existence of that remarkable dog on the spot. But quick as lightning Henri interposed the butt of his rifle, and Jim's shin met it with a violence that caused him to howl with rage and pain. "Oh! Pardon me, broder," cried Henri, shrinking back, with the drollest expression of mingled pity and glee. Jim's discretion, on this occasion, was superior to his valor. He turned away with a coarse expression of anger and left the ground. Meanwhile the major handed the silver rifle to young Varlev. "It couldn't have fallen into better hands," he said. "You'll do it credit, lad, I know that full well, and let me assure you it will never play you false. Only keep it clean, don't overcharge it, aim true, and it will never miss the mark." While the hunters crowded round Dick to congratulate him and examine the piece, he stood with a mingled feeling of bashfulness and delight at his unexpected good fortune. Recovering himself suddenly, he seized his old rifle, and, dropping quietly to the outskirts of the crowd, while the men were still busy handling and discussing the merits of the prize, went up, unobserved, to a boy of about 13 years of age, and touched him on the shoulder. "Here, Marston, you know I often said you should have the old rifle when I was rich enough to get a new one. Take it now, lad. It's come to you sooner than either of us expected." "Dick," said the boy, grasping his friend's hand warmly, "you're true as heart of oak. It's good of ye, that's a fact." "Not a bit. It costs me nothing to give away an old gun that I've no use for, boy, and's worth little, but it makes me right glad to have the chance to do it." Marston had longed for a rifle ever since he could walk, but his prospects of obtaining one were very poor indeed at that time, and it is a question whether he did not at that moment experience as much joy in handling the old piece as his friend felt in shouldering the prize. A difficulty now occurred which had not before been thought of. This was no less than the absolute refusal of Dick Varley's canine property to follow him. Fan had no idea of changing masters without her consent being asked, or her inclination being consulted. "You'll have to tie her up for a while, I fear," said the Major. "No fear," answered the youth. "Dog nature's like human nature." Saying this, he seized Crusoe by the neck, stuffed him comfortably into the bosom of his hunting shirt, and walked rapidly away with the prize rifle on his shoulder. Fan had not bargained for this. She stood irresolute, gazing now to the right and now to the left, as the Major retired in one direction and Dick with Crusoe in another. Suddenly Crusoe, who, although comfortable in body, was ill at ease in spirit, gave utterance to a melancholy howl. The mother's love instantly prevailed. For one moment she pricked up her ears at the sound, and then, lowering them, trotted quietly after her new master, and followed him to his cottage on the margin of the lake. Chapter 3. The Widow and Son. Hopes and wishes commingled with hard facts. The dog. Crusoe's education begun. It is pleasant to look upon a serene, quiet, humble face. On such a face did Richard Varley look every night when he entered his mother's cottage. Mrs. Varley was a widow, and she had followed the fortunes of her brother, Daniel Hood, ever since the death of her husband. Love for her only brother induced her to forsake the peaceful village of Maryland and enter upon the wild life of a backwoods settlement. Dick's mother was thin, and old, and wrinkled, but her face was stamped with a species of beauty which never fades, the beauty of a loving look. Ah! The brow of snow and the peach-blown cheek may snare the heart of man for a time, but the loving look alone can forge that adamantine chain that time, age, eternity, shall never break. Mistake us not, reader, and bear with us if we attempt to analyze this look which characterized Mrs. Varley. A rare diamond is worth stopping to glance at, even when one is in a hurry. The brightest jewel in the human heart is worth a thought or two. By a loving look, we do not mean a look of love bestowed on a beloved object. That is common enough, and thankful should we be that it is so common in a world that's overfull of hatred. Still less do we mean that smile and look of intense affection with which some people, good people too, greet friend and foe alike, and by which effort, to work out their beau ideal of the expression of Christian love, they do signally damage their cause, by saddening the serious and repelling the gay. Much less do we mean that perpetual smile of goodwill which argues more of personal comfort and self-love than anything else. No, the loving look we speak of is as often grave as gay. Its character depends very much on the face through which it beams. And it cannot be counterfeited. Its ring defies imitation. Like the clouded sun of April, it can pierce through tears of sorrow. Like the noontide sun of summer, it can blaze in warm smiles. Like the northern lights of winter, it can gleam in depths of woe. But it is always the same, modified, doubtless, and rendered more or less patent to others, according to the natural amiability of him or her who bestows it. No one can put it on. Still less can anyone put it off. Its range is universal, it embraces all mankind, though, of course, it is intensified on a few favorite objects. Its seat is in the depths of a renewed heart, and its foundation lies in love to God. Young Yarley's mother lived in a cottage which was of the smallest possible dimensions, consistent with comfort. It was made of logs, as, indeed, were all the other cottages in the valley. The door was in the center, and a passage from it to the back of the dwelling divided it into 2 rooms. One of these was subdivided by a thin partition, the inner room being Mrs. Varley's bedroom, the outer Dick's. Daniel Hood's dormitory was a corner of the kitchen, which apartment served also as a parlor. The rooms were lighted by 2 windows, one on each side of the door, which gave to the house the appearance of having a nose and 2 eyes. Houses of this kind have literally got a sort of expression on, if we may use the word, their countenances. Square windows give the appearance of easygoing placidity, longish ones, that of surprise. Mrs. Yarley's was a surprised cottage, and this was in keeping with the scene in which it stood, for the clear lake in front, studded with islands, and the distant hills beyond, composed a scene so surprisingly beautiful that it never failed to call forth an expression of astonished admiration from every new visitor to the Mustang Valley. "My boy," exclaimed Mrs. Yarley, as her son entered the cottage with a bound, "why so hurried today?" "Dearie me! Where got you the grand gun?" "Won it, mother." "Won it, my son?" "I won it, mother." "Drove the nail almost, and would ha' drove it altogether had I been more used to Joe Blunt's rifle." Mrs. Yarley's heart beat high, and her face flushed with pride as she gazed at her son, who laid the rifle on the table for her inspection, while he rattled off an animated and somewhat disjointed account of the match. "Dearie me! Now that was good, that was Diver. But what's that scraping at the door? Oh, that's Fan, I forgot her. Here. Here. Fan. Come in, good dog," he cried, rising and opening the door. Fan entered and stopped short, evidently uncomfortable. "My boy, what do you with the Major's dog?" "Won her too, mother." "Won her, my son?" "I won her, and the pup too, see, here it is," and he plucked Crusoe from his bosom. Crusoe, having found his position to be one of great comfort, had fallen into a profound slumber, and on being thus unceremoniously awakened, he gave forth a yelp of discontent that brought Fan in a state of frantic sympathy to his side. "There you are, Fan, take it to a corner and make yourself at home." "Aye, that's right, mother, give her something to eat, she's hungry, I know by the look o' her eye." "Dearie me, Dick," said Mrs. Varley, who now proceeded to spread the youth's midday meal before him, "did you drive the nail 3 times?" "No, only once, and that not perfectly. Brought 'em all down at one shot, rifle, fan, and pup." Well, now that was Diver, but," here the old woman paused and looked grave. "But what, mother? You'll be wantin' to go off to the mountains now, I fear me, boy." "Wantin' now," exclaimed the youth earnestly. "I'm always wantin'. I've been wantin' ever since I could walk, but I won't go till you let me, mother, that I won't." And he struck the table with his fist so forcibly that the platters rung again. "You're a good boy, Dick, but you're too young yet to venture among the redskins. And yet, if I don't venture young, I'd better not venture at all. You know, mother dear, I don't want to leave you, but I was born to be a hunter, and everybody in them parts is a hunter, and I can't hunt in the kitchen, you know, mother." At this point the conversation was interrupted by a sound that caused young Yarley to spring up and seize his rifle, and Fan to show her teeth and growl. "Hist! Mother, that's like horses' hoofs," he whispered, opening the door and gazing intently in the direction whence the sound came. Louder and louder it came, until an opening in the forest showed the advancing cavalcade to be a party of white men. In another moment they were in full view, a band of about 30 horsemen, clad in the leathern costume, and armed with the long rifle of the far west. Some wore portions of the gaudy Indian dress which gave to them a brilliant, dashing look. They came on straight for the blockhouse, and saluted the Varleys with a jovial cheer as they swept past at full speed. Dick returned the cheer with compound interest, and calling out, "They're trappers, mother, I'll be back in an hour," bounded off like a deer through the woods, taking a short cut in order to reach the blockhouse before them. He succeeded, for, just as he arrived at the house, the cavalcade wheeled round the bend in the river, dashed up the slope, and came to a sudden halt on the green. Vaulting from their foaming steeds, they tied them to the stockades of the little fortress, which they entered in a body. Hot haste was in every motion of these men. They were trappers, they said, on their way to the Rocky Mountains to hunt and trade furs. But one of their number had been treacherously murdered and scalped by a Pawnee chief, and they resolved to revenge his death by an attack on one of the Pawnee villages. They would teach these red reptiles to respect white men, they would, come of it what might, and they had turned aside here to procure an additional supply of powder and lead. In vain did the major endeavor to dissuade these reckless men from their purpose. They scoffed at the idea of returning good for evil, and insisted on being supplied. The log hut was a store as well as a place of defense, and as they offered to pay for it there was no refusing their request, at least so the major thought. The ammunition was therefore given to them, and in half an hour they were away again at full gallop over the plains on their mission of vengeance. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." But these men knew not what God said, because they never read his word, and did not own his sway. Young Varley's enthusiasm was considerably damped when he learned the errand on which the trappers were bent. From that time forward he gave up all desire to visit the mountains in company with such men, but he still retained an intense longing to roam at large among their rocky fastnesses, and gallop out upon the wide prairies. Meanwhile he dutifully tended his mother's cattle and sheep, and contented himself with an occasional deer hunt in the neighboring forests. He devoted himself also to the training of his dog Crusoe, an operation which at first cost him many a deep sigh. Everyone has heard of the sagacity and almost reasoning capabilities of the Newfoundland dog. Indeed, some have even gone the length of saying that what is called instinct in these animals is neither more nor less than reason. And, in truth, many of the noble, heroic, and sagacious deeds that have actually been performed by Newfoundland dogs incline us almost to believe that, like man, they are gifted with reasoning powers. But everyone does not know the trouble and patience that is required in order to get a juvenile dog to understand what its master means when he is endeavoring to instruct it. Crusoe's first lesson was an interesting, but not a very successful one. We may remark here that Dick Yarley had presented Fan to his mother to be her watchdog, resolving to devote all his powers to the training of the pup. We may also remark, in reference to Crusoe's appearance, and we did not remark it sooner, chiefly because up to this period in least eventful history he was little better than a ball of fat and hair, that his coat was mingled jet black and pure white, and remarkably glossy, curly, and thick. A week after the shooting match, Crusoe's education began. Having fed him for that period with his own hand, in order to gain his affection, Dick took him out one sunny forenoon to the margin of the lake, to give him his first lesson. And here again we must pause to remark that, although a dog's heart is generally gained in the first instance through his mouth, yet, after it is thoroughly gained, his affection is noble and disinterested. He can scarcely be driven from his master's side by blows, and even when thus harshly repelled is always ready, on the shortest notice and with the slightest encouragement, to make it up again. Well, Dick Varley began by calling out Crusoe. "Crusoe! Come here, pup." Of course Crusoe knew his name by this time, for it had been so often used as a prelude to his meals that he naturally expected a feed whenever he heard it. This portal to his brain had already been open for some days, but all the other doors were fast locked, and it required a great deal of careful picking to open them. "Now, Crusoe, come here." Crusoe bounded clumsily to his master's side, cocked his ears, and wagged his tail. So far his education was perfect. We say he bounded clumsily, for it must be remembered that he was still a very young pup, with soft, flabby muscles. "Now, I'm going to begin your education, pup dash, think of that." Whether Crusoe thought of that or not we cannot say, but he looked up in his master's face as he spoke, cocked his ears very high, and turned his head slowly to one side, until it could not turn any further in that direction. Then he turned it as much to the other side, whereat his master burst into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, and Crusoe immediately began barking vociferously. "Come, come," said Dick, suddenly checking his mirth, "we mustn't play, pup, we must work." Drawing a leathern mitten from his belt, the youth held it to Crusoe's nose, and then threw it a yard away, at the same time exclaiming in a loud, distinct tone, "Fetch it." Crusoe entered at once into the spirit of this part of his training. He dashed gleefully at the mitten, and proceeded to worry it with intense gratification. As for fetch it, he neither understood the words nor cared a straw about them. Dick Varley rose immediately, and rescuing the mitten, resumed his seat on a rock. "Come here, Crusoe," he repeated. "Oh, certainly, by all means," said Crusoe, "N.O." He didn't exactly say it, but really he looked these words be evidently that we think it right to let them stand as they are written. If he could have finished the sentence, he would certainly have said, "Go on with that game over again, old boy, it's quite to my taste, the jolliest thing in life, I assure you." At least, if we may not positively assert that he would have said that, no one else can absolutely affirm that he wouldn't. Well, Dick Varley did do it over again, and Crusoe worried the mitten over again, utterly regardless of fetch-it. Then they did it again, and again, and again, but without the slightest apparent advancement in the path of canine knowledge, and then they went home. During all this trying operation, Dick Varley never once betrayed the slightest feeling of irritability or impatience. He did not expect success at first. He was not, therefore, disappointed at failure. Next day he had him out again, and the next, and the next, and the next again, with the like unfavorable result. In short, it seemed at last as if Crusoe's mind had been deeply imbued with the idea that he had been born expressly for the purpose of worrying that mitten, and he meant to fulfill his destiny to the letter. Young Varley had taken several small pieces of meat in his pocket each day, with the intention of rewarding Crusoe when he should at length be prevailed on to fetch the mitten, but as Crusoe was not aware of the treat that awaited him, of course the mitten never was fetched. At last Dick Varley saw that this system would never do, so he changed his tactics, and the next morning gave Crusoe no breakfast, but took him out at the usual hour to go through his lesson. This new course of conduct seemed to perplex Crusoe not a little, for on his way down to the beach he paused frequently and looked back at the cottage, and then expressively up at his master's face. But the master was inexorable. He went on and Crusoe followed, for true love had now taken possession of the pup's young heart, and he preferred his master's company to food. Varley now began by letting the learner smell a piece of meat which he eagerly sought to devour, but was prevented, to his immense disgust. Then the mitten was thrown as heretofore, and Crusoe made a few steps towards it, but being in no mood for play he turned back. "Fetch it," said the teacher. "I won't," replied the learner mutely, by means of that expressive sign, not doing it. Hereupon Dick Varley rose, took up the mitten, and put it into the pup's mouth. Then, retiring a couple of yards, he held out the piece of meat and said, "Fetch it." Crusoe instantly spat out the glove and bounded towards the meat, once more to be disappointed. This was done a second time, and Crusoe came forward with the mitten in his mouth. It seemed as if it had been done accidentally, for he dropped it before coming quite up. If so, it was a fortunate accident, for it served as the tiny fulcrum on which to place the point of that mighty lever which was destined ere long to raise him to the pinnacle of canine erudition. Dick Varley immediately lavished upon him the tenderest caresses and gave him a lump of meat. But he quickly tried it again lest he should lose the lesson. The dog evidently felt that if he did not fetch that mitten he should have no meat or caresses. In order, however, to make sure that there was no mistake, Dick laid the mitten down beside the pup, instead of putting it into his mouth, and, retiring a few paces, cried, "Fetch it." Crusoe looked uncertain for a moment, then he picked up the mitten and laid it at his master's feet. The lesson was learned at last. Dick Varley tumbled all the meat out of his pocket on the ground, and, while Crusoe made a hearty breakfast, he sat down on a rock and whistled with glee at having fairly picked the lock, and opened another door into one of the many chambers of his dog's intellect.